thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Giovanni, for the invitation, and that's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for having me. So I'll start with a few words about the title of the lecture. So it's a bit of a provocative title, Is the EU Becoming French? But I hope that I can eventually convince you that there is some interest in some interesting ideas behind this provocative title. In case you're interested, this is a 1960s cartoon showing French President de Gaulle talking with the German Chancellor Adenauer with a map of French Europe behind him. So typically having fun of the French self-perception of being very, very great, in particular President de Gaulle's self-perception. So that's not just a question of reality, that's also a question of illusion, as shown in this cartoon. But first of all, before talking about how the European Union might become more French at the moment, I would like to start with the opposite.
Does it work? Fantastic. What?
Oh yes,
yes,
that's okay.
This one.
This one, okay.
Okay.
Sorry. I would like to start with the opposite argument. That is the kind of argument you would see if you wanted to follow the French media. The basic argument you would find if you had a look at the French media is that actually France's influence within the European Union debate is in decline. And I'd like to just have a look at the reasons that are put forward for this decline. First of all, there is the recent political crisis that France went through during the summer. So the party of President Macron lost basically the European election. He was weakened at the European level for that reason. He then dissolved the parliament and was also weakened with the outcome, giving a hung parliament in which he couldn't have the same number of seats that he previously had, and he didn't have a clear majority. So he had to find a compromise with other parties. So basically the conclusion of that summer crisis is that President Macron, we used to think that he could have some strong personal leadership in the European debate, will no longer be able to do that because he's weakened domestically. Second argument, France's public deficit. In the French debate, that's really everywhere, the fact that the number one task for the French government is to address this question of the deficit. Of course, it means that the French government position within the European Union debate is weakened because it would be under the close surveillance of European institutions, in particular the European Commission. Second problem. Third problem, that's illustrated by the cartoon you have here, the fact that when negotiating the constitution of the new European Commission after the European election, the candidates that President Macron wanted to keep in place as a French commissioner, Thierry Breton, was essentially basically rejected by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And again, that was the fact that President Macron had to accept this rejection and come up with an alternative name. That was essentially interpreted as evidence of weakness and a loss of influence for the French government. And finally, you might have heard also recent debates about the EU-Mercosur agreement negotiations, and you might have noticed that when the media report on this debate, there is basically a difference between France and the rest of Europe. Basically, France is very much isolated on this discussion. The only country that is at least openly and very vocally against this agreement and trying to prevent this agreement to be approved. And at the moment, the French government is basically trying to find like-minded governments to find a blocking minority against this agreement. So once again, France is isolated. But now my basic argument here at the end, after having reviewed all those elements, is that these are also shorter-term developments, and perhaps these are also the trees hiding the forest. And perhaps behind these, there are also bigger and longer-term trends that would suggest a different assessment of the relationship between France and the European Union system or the European Union debate. So just I put here as some kind of self-promotion the cover of my recent book, because basically these arguments the argument I will present here in this slide were essentially developed in this book. Basically, my main argument in this presentation is that the European Union is going through a huge transformation at the moment. Not because of France, absolutely not. Because of the impact of basically great power competition on it. But the effect of this transformation, driven by great power competition, tends to drive the European Union debate closer to France's traditional preferences. And that's the argument I would like to develop here. So what do I mean by great power competition? Obviously, you have, in terms of the security, Russian imperialism. I don't have to put much emphasis on this. And obviously, in combination with the election of Donald Trump, so the conclusion that European security is under stress and that something should be done to address this, at the same time, this threat and this threat of abandonment or of relative disengagement from the United States. So that's the first point. Second point would be more connected to China and the other great power having a major influence on global politics. And here the impact would be more in terms of the economy. If you think about the rising US-China rivalry in terms of the economy, in terms of technology, that also kind of produced a new turn in the evolution of the international political economy. What can be described as a crisis of the more traditional neoliberal order and a rise of potentially a new global economic order that could be described as a geo-economic order that is much less focused on openness and globalization, but more focused on security, fear of dependence, and much more connected to power competition between major powers. And basically, the argument here is that the effect of these major trends impact the two big debates in which France traditionally had more or less marginal preferences in comparison with the broader European debate. So first, there's, in terms of security, the debate on how European security should be managed and understood. Traditionally, and I will develop this point, France has been in favor of a certain level of European autonomy. You know, perhaps the current concept of European strategic autonomy that the French like to promote at the European level. It's absolutely not new for France, and it has been something that the French governments have tried to push for a long time. But obviously this evolution with Russian imperialism and the refocus of US power progressively, arguably, away from Europe and perhaps increasingly towards Asia that tends to give this argument in favor of more autonomy in the area of security more legitimacy in the European debate. Second argument, so I talked about the geo-economic turn at the global level, and that was also a contentious point for France in its relation with the European debate. France's preference was traditionally closer to the concept of interventionism, the idea that states or public organizations, for that matter, like the European Union, should have a stronger interventionist role in managing the economy, and that the economy should not just be a matter for free market to self-regulate itself. Okay, so that's also an element that is moving, and that is perhaps moving closer to the French preference. And a final element in terms of the broader context that's more directly connected to the European debate, that would be Brexit. Because Britain, before Brexit, was also typically a country crystallizing the opposite of the French preference, if you like. If you think about the debate on Atlantic versus European security, of course, Britain has always been very suspicious vis-à-vis any European defense initiative, and insisted a lot on the idea that essentially everything had to be kept within the framework of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And also, Britain was seen as the most neoliberal power in the European debate. So Brexit also perhaps facilitated the evolution of the European debate on these 2 points. Now, this is the general argument, and I will develop these 2 points one after the other. So first, the question of security and strategic autonomy. And here I would like to go back in time a little bit to illustrate France's traditional preferences, how they were initially isolated and marginalized, and how progressively they became closer to the mainstream or the center of gravity of the European debate. I would start with the Suez crisis, which was really, it happened at the beginning of European integration history, when the Treaty of Rome was being negotiated. And so the Suez crisis, basically, that was started with the decision of Egyptian President Nasser to nationalize the Canal of Suez. That was basically under the control of previous colonial powers, the UK and France, and both decided, in partnership with Israel at the moment, to launch a military operation against Egypt to take the control of the canal. And what happened at that moment is that both Washington and Moscow, so perhaps one of the few instances of objective coordination between, or cooperation between the two rival superpowers during the Cold War, both adopted the same decision that those European powers had to withdraw, and that Egypt should be respected in its territorial integrity. And eventually the UK decided that it could not resist pressure from the United States, and France also followed suit. And the conclusion that the French elite at the moment drew from that experience was that even though US a strong partnership with the United States was crucial and vital in Europe, there were also other issues globally on which the French and more generally Europeans could be in disagreement with the Americans. So that alternative frameworks, formats, would also be interesting, because if they only had as an option transatlantic formats with the United States, they could be weakened globally. And actually, the first who tried to push this idea of European autonomy, that was de Gaulle. So General de Gaulle came back to power in 1958, so not a long time after the Suez crisis. And at that moment, during the summer of 1958, there was also a crisis in the Middle East, in which the United States and the United Kingdom intervened in the region, in particular in Jordan and Lebanon. And the French were also frustrated because they had not been consulted, basically, by the special partnership, the two powers of the special partnership. And during the summer, in a discussion with the Italian Prime Minister, de Gaulle formulated for the first time his idea that Europeans had to find some kind of format to be heard. Not to be against the US and British, because obviously they were allies, but to be able to have more influence vis-à-vis this couple between the US and the UK. And eventually that became what was eventually known in the 1960s as the Fouché Plan, so a French-led plan for what was named at that time political cooperation at the European level. And by political they meant cooperation in terms of international relations, international security, defense, this kind of thing. And eventually it fell because first other member states were not interested in an alternative format that according to them could weaken the solidity and the cohesion of the West. Having a European format within the West could give the impression that there were divisions, and eventually perhaps the USSR perhaps could benefit from this sense of division. So the other members of the European community were not interested. And that failed, but that was the first instance in which France's isolation in its attempt to push forward the idea of European autonomy in the area of international relations and international security was observed. Then, after the Cold War, another interesting instance in terms of the concept of autonomy is the Saint-Malo Declaration between the UK and France. So that was Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac. So basically that was the beginning of the European Union policy in the area of defense. Eventually it became essentially an operational policy, the ability to launch military operations in the name of the European Union. But the basic agreement was a French-British agreement. And it was a compromise. For the British, what was very important was that if there had to be a European Union defense policy, it should not compete with NATO. It should only be in complementarity with NATO. But the French input in that compromise was already the idea of autonomy. The European Union should be able to launch a military operation on its own. That was what the French were demanding. So again, an example of how it was put forward. Was it successful? Not necessarily. Another example, what happened a few years after that, when the United States decided to invade Iraq, there was obviously a big debate within Europe between those who supported the United States and contributed with troops to the US plan and those who opposed, in particular the French and the Germans. And this debate was also sometimes presented as a debate between Atlanticists and Europeanists. Atlanticists arguing that nothing could be done without the framework of a close transatlantic partnership within NATO, and Europeanists insisting also because they felt that there was a potential for disagreement with the United States, that the European Union should have the ability to have its own foreign policy in some kind of autonomy. Now, if we're moving on to today's concept of strategic autonomy. It was for the first time written down in a European Union document in 2013, and initially it also came from a French person, but within European Union institutions. It was Commissioner Barnier, so he was a member of the European Commission at the time, now he's the Prime Minister of France, and in a Commission paper on defense research and the idea that the European Commission could contribute and could finance defense research in Europe, he put forward this idea of strategic autonomy that was eventually endorsed by the European Council, so they had the states and governments. At that moment you also have this global international environment shift that I was mentioning in the introduction. So Brexit, and Brexit also changed the debate in the area of security and defense, because Britain had vetoed a certain number of ideas that now became open and possible to explore, because Britain, even before it was formally out of the European Union, would no longer exercise this veto. But there was also, of course, the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. And so this concept of strategic autonomy became increasingly embedded in European Union debates. And if you look at the document that was produced by the European Union at the time, when Federica Mogherini was the High Representative of the European Union, there were obviously many consultations with member states. And the main contribution from French diplomats or politicians who were consulted in this process was to put forward this concept of strategic autonomy. And that's basically the first document that popularized at the level of the EU bubble the concept of strategic autonomy, but it was behind the process, it was really pushed by the French. But here, these are just rhetorical statements, okay? It's not really an actual outcome. What made a difference is the combination of Russia and the United States moving. So the first step is what I would call Ukraine won, Trump won. That is the combination of the beginning of the war in Ukraine and the first presidency of Donald Trump. That led the European Commission and the previous head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, to put forward what I believe is the first important European Union initiative in the area of defense in terms of capabilities, not just in terms of being able to launch a military operation. That's the European Defense Fund. That was the first time money from the European Union budget was invested in defense. Initially in a very modest way, because it was essentially to finance research and development, not acquisition per se. But it was the first step. And strategic autonomy is presented in the regulation of the European Defence Fund as a key objective. So it was now embedded into European law. And for instance, the European Defence Fund's task is to strengthen and to finance European Union companies. And that was also presented as a way to achieve strategic autonomy. You want to strengthen European Union industry because Europeans can control European Union industry, they cannot control the industry of other countries in the world. And it's more secure if their own industry can provide what they need in terms of defense. And now we are in the second stage of that combination between Ukraine war and Donald Trump. Basically what happened after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was the decision, and again, interestingly, that was under the French presidency of the European Union. So French, by chance, had the presidency of the European Union in the first semester of 2022. And there was a big summit in Versailles that really launched this idea that in response to the war in Ukraine, there should be a new generation of EU initiatives in the area of defense. Basically, there were two directions that were followed. First, investing European Union money to support joint acquisition of military equipment by the European Union member states. So facilitating certain convergence in terms of the models, so strengthening procurement and more defense spending, but also facilitating coordination, cooperation, so that economies of scale could be found, and so that a certain interoperability between European forces could be facilitated. And a second part that was pushed forward a bit after that was also a policy to encourage the industry to increase its production capacity, the defense industry. Though also in line with the general objective of strategic autonomy, having a European Union defense industry that is able to produce more in times of war. And that was also implemented by a member of the European Commission who happened to be French also. Thierry Breton was responsible for industry and defense in the previous commission, and now there is a commissioner for defense who's not French, but who in a way also crystallized this French idea that the European Union should be an important defense actor, and that the European Union is a legitimate actor in the area of defense, which was not obvious at the beginning of the process. So basically the conclusion from this is that the idea that defense should also be a policy for a European format, for the European Union, in the idea that strategic autonomy should be an objective. That was initially a very French idea, promoted in relative isolation in the European debate, and that's now closer to, I don't mean that there is no debate, obviously there is a debate, but closer to the European mainstream. Now moving on to the second point that I want to mention, the economic debate. Again, I would like to go back in time a little to give you a sense of the French tradition in terms of economic policies. Going back to the 17th century, because that's also a kind of doctrine that's sometimes connected to the name of a famous minister of Louis XIV in France, Colbert. So he was the treasury minister of King Louis XIV in France, and developed a strategy, a political economy that was both mercantilist, so trying to increase export, to get additional revenues from external trade for France, but also to increase France's power through the economy. And eventually the objective was that the king would be stronger in Europe because he would have more money to buy more troops. So this strong connection between the economic development and power that was really visible in what is sometimes called Colbertism in the French economic debate. Second interesting example, Napoleon, and particularly the continental blockade that was implemented when the French Empire was at its maximum degree of power between 1806 and 1814. The objective was to isolate Britain and the British Empire. And since Britain was very dependent on its trade, the idea that the French tried to implement, it didn't work at all, but that was their objective, to strangle and to kill Britain by killing its trade. So a continental blockade that almost included the whole Europe, because many parts of Europe were either occupied or under French influence at the time. And I've noticed that sometimes it remained in the imagination or the perceptions of certain members of the European elites. I was talking not so long ago with a Dutch representative, so from the Netherlands, and he told me that really crystallized the difference in terms of our conception of the economy. You, the French, you see the economy as a tool for power, like Napoleon, when it used trade to kill the British Empire. We, the Netherlands, we are open and we want to have as much trade as possible. So that's a way, a kind of illustration of this traditional way of thinking about the economy in the French tradition. That was initially not so diffused in Europe and in the world. If you think about it, also, I want to mention the coal and steel community, because most of the time in the general debate, this first step of European integration, the Treaty of Paris, is presented with noble and generous ideas about peace and European cooperation and so on. But it's very clear that for the French, the motivation behind the establishment of this first European community, the coal and steel community, that was also about geoeconomics. That is, doing power competition through the economy. The objective was that the strong German industry was the sources of its military strength, eventually. So if you wanted to keep Germany under control as a military power, you had to keep it under control in terms of its industry. So the coal and steel community was to prevent Germany to exploit its strong industry to become a great military and aggressive power again. So that was also using the economy with international security objectives and power objectives. And if you think about trade and openness and market integration, that would be the idea behind the Treaty of Rome, the common market. And here, the French were much more reluctant. In this case, it was not initially a French idea. It was much more pushed forward by Benelux countries, this idea of a general common market. And for a long time during the negotiation of the Treaty of Rome, the French were convinced that it would eventually be bad for France, because basically the German industry would be stronger and would be more competitive, and it would be and the French industry would be defeated in an open market. Closer to us, another example illustrating this relationship between France and a neoliberal mainstream ideology in Europe is the 2005 referendum, because that was also a moment of high politicization of European politics, because there was a referendum. And at the moment there was also, by coincidence, a negotiation in Brussels about the so-called Bolkestein Directive, about service liberalization, with the idea that you could basically be hired in a country with the legislation and the regulation of your country of origin. So even if you were coming from a country with a much more relaxed or deregulated system. And basically that was a key moment in which, in the French debate, the European Union, the European Commission, started to be presented as an economic problem, like the Trojan horse of neoliberal globalization. So that was the beginning of that really crystallized an ideological tension between the French mainstream, basically, and the European mainstream. And that was also the basis of legitimacy of many parties in the French debate, who argued we cannot really continue to fully support European integration, because that's the way towards a neoliberal agenda that we oppose. So again, a sense of France being at ease with neoliberalism and with the European integration project, because neoliberalism is so embedded into the European Union system. Another example of that, the debate about competition. So part of the French argument about geoeconomics is the idea that public authority, whether at the national or European level, should also intervene to create champions, great companies, at the national or European level, so that they would better compete against external big companies. And that was basically the rationale for the French-German coordination and idea of a fusion of Alstom and Siemens. And that was rejected by the European Commission, by Commissioner Vestager, on the ground of European Union competition rules. And that was also an important moment of ideological clash between this French idea that if we want to be effective, we should have European champion, and this European neoliberal or ordo-liberal mainstream that, no, what is important is open market and fair and open competition. And you don't want to create champion, you want a fair competition among everybody. But that was perhaps the last stage of this confrontation, because after that, it was also under the Trump presidency, came the beginning of the US-China trade and tech wars. Also, a change of tone in the debate about trade between Europe, the United States, and China. And that was the beginning of the weakening of this neoliberal consensus and the rise of the geoeconomic consensus. First stage was Trump tariffs. So first, the tension between the US and China that pushed many people in Europe to think about how should we react in a world that is increasingly about trade tensions and trade wars. Then there were also Trump tariffs against the European Union, and some of the first initiatives that were put in place at the level of the European Union were not just in reaction to China, but also in reaction to US policies, how to defend ourselves against Trump tariffs, and that will obviously become a debate again in the next few months. COVID-19 also accelerated this trend, because it really illustrated Europe's weakness in a case of disruption of global chains of production, when many industry had to be cut from international trade in China, and how it spilled over to the European industry. And it really legitimized this argument that trade might be good in general, but sometimes it's also a vulnerability. That dependence or over-dependence on a single trade partner can be a vulnerability. And from that moment, the European Commission, that was called the Trojan horse of globalization a few years before that, started to systematically review any sector and see, is there a vulnerability? Are we too dependent? Should we revise our position in this sector? So that was a change of tone and also of political orientation. And eventually it became also theorized or put forward at the highest level. For instance, when Ursula von der Leyen came to power as the President of the European Commission in 2019, she said, I want to lead a geopolitical commission. And if you think about it, since the Commission is essentially an economic actor, saying I want to have a geopolitical commission means I want to have economic policies that are not just meant to increase benefits in the spirit of free trade and neoliberal policies, but I want to use economic policies in a geopolitical way. So that was also a geoeconomic term in this sense. And during COVID, that also the European Commission also put forward this concept of open strategic autonomy, which is interesting because that was the concept of strategic autonomy as developed initially in the area of defense and security, and it was eventually transposed to the area of the economy, trade, and technology. With the addition of this term open, just to say, okay, but doesn't mean we are protectionist. It just means that we don't want to be exploited, we don't want to be vulnerable, but eventually we are also open to the idea of perhaps erecting new barriers if it's needed. So and it became a guiding concept for the European Commission, open strategic autonomy. Similarly, technological sovereignty, that's basically the same idea as applied to the area of technology. The French Commissioner Thierry Breton also really very much put forward that concept, and that tended also to create some kind of internal debate within the Commission, with Commissioner Vestager in charge of competition, embodying the traditional neoliberal ideology, and Commissioner Breton promoting more initiatives in the area of defense, technological sovereignty, industry, interventionism in industry, closer to this new turn towards economic interventionism, closer to, obviously, the French traditional preference. And there are many, in terms of geoeconomics, there are many initiatives that we can put under the flag of geoeconomic Europe. I've just put some examples here. So foreign direct investment screening, so the idea that the European Union would encourage its member states to block certain foreign investments if they think that they could cause a security problem. Foreign subsidies regulation, so that's the idea that the European Union should not just monitor member states' subsidies that would affect fair competition in the European market, but also foreign external states' subsidies. And it was also very much connected to some practice by the Chinese states subsidizing Chinese companies either to invest in Europe or to acquire European companies. Anti-coercion instruments, strengthening the ability of the European Union to fight back when targeted by sanctions. Initially it was designed by thinking about Trump tariffs, but eventually it was also accelerated by some sanctions imposed by China on Lithuania when Lithuania decided to increase its level of cooperation with Taiwan. So there were repercussions with China, and it really legitimized the idea that there should be some kind of European solidarity to fight back when a particular member state was targeted with this kind of sanction. De-risking, that's also the concept that was put forward by Ursula von der Leyen when she went to visit China last year. So the idea that it was not about completely decoupling the trade relationship, but that there was a systematic review to put forward in order to alleviate the potentially security risks involved in the trade relationship. And in terms of industrial strategy, that was also, it's not just putting barriers that tend to limit trade and exchanges because you think that sometimes they can lead to a vulnerability. There was also the idea that the European Commission should be more interventionist vis-à-vis the European industry, and that was also very much illustrated by Commissioner Breton, for instance, directly intervening in the sector of vaccine industry during COVID to make sure that a whole production chain could be located in Europe so that Europeans would not be too dependent on vaccines produced outside of the European Union. Also intervening in the production of artillery shells under the slogan "war economy," which is a bit of an overstatement, but still that was also a way to justify that the European Commission directly intervenes in the industrial strategy of those companies to increase their production capacity, or the European Chips Act intervening in the area of semiconductors production, as seen in the picture here, or the so-called IRIS-2 constellation, so a project of internet communication by satellites put forward by the European Commission. So not just laissez-faire, free trade and letting the market solve the problems, but really interventionism even in the industry. So again, just like in the area of security, an illustration of how the mood changed around French preferences and eventually put them also at the center of the European debate. Now, at the end, I also wanted to show what I think is a complementary evolution in this debate. The fact that it's not only that the European debate is progressively moving closer to French traditional preferences, it's also that French preferences are also moving closer to the European mainstream. And I just took two examples here. If we think about those traditional French preferences that were illustrated by President de Gaulle in the 1960s, one was rejection of enlargement or reluctance vis-à-vis enlargement. You have a cartoon showing de Gaulle pushing the UK out of the European community. And basically the rationale behind this was very much connected to the two debates I mentioned earlier. The UK was seen as too Atlanticist and too neoliberal, basically. And conversely, the British membership was very much supported by the Netherlands for the opposite reasons, basically. And second point of contention, the relationship with NATO. Because France insisted on the importance of having some kind of autonomous European format within the Atlantic Alliance, it was also seen as an awkward member within the Atlantic Alliance. In particular illustrated by President de Gaulle's decision to leave not NATO, because politically France remained an ally, but to leave the integrated command structure of NATO in 1966. And those 2 points are moving in the French debate at the moment. First, enlargement. It has been observed by many people that France was happy to promote the idea of enlargement to Ukraine, both within the European Union and NATO. In the summer of 2022, President Macron also wanted to show, when he went to a trip to Kiev with the Italian Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, the Romanian President, and basically wanted to give the impression that he was the driver behind this agreement that Ukraine would be eventually a member of the European Union, which was very surprising for many observers who thought that France is always the last country to agree on enlargement. And an hypothesis is that for that enlargement, Ukraine is not necessarily seen as a country that would go against those French preferences. If you think about having a stronger defense and more states' intervention into the economy and the industry, it might be that Ukraine could eventually strengthen and reinforce the legitimacy of this geopolitical project. Because a union that would include Ukraine could no longer be just a a loose free trade area. That would definitely be a geopolitical union, which is in line with the French long-term project. And second, NATO. Part of the French diplomacy in the last few years has been some kind of rapprochement with Eastern European countries, the so-called Eastern flank countries. And that started in particular in May 23 with the so-called Bratislava speech by President Macron, in which he said, in the past we have been bad with you, we didn't listen to you, now we have to work closely. And that was eventually followed by the decision to support Ukrainian membership in NATO, a more positive wording about NATO. For instance, instead of just talking about strategic autonomy in the European Union, the French started to talk about a European pillar within NATO, started to promote France's strong contribution within NATO. France became, for the first time, a framework nation in the context of NATO's forward presence in Eastern flank countries, in particular in Romania. It was also in this context that you can understand the debate launched in February this year about the hypothesis of boots on the ground in Ukraine. That was also an area in which France was happy to get closer to the traditional vision put forward by Eastern flank countries. So France is no longer in an awkward position vis-à-vis NATO. And my hypothesis here is that in a context in which it's obvious that it's obvious that the United States will evolve vis-à-vis Europe and vis-à-vis its contribution in NATO. The United States, in particular with Donald Trump, would argue that now its main priority is no longer Europe, it would be Asia, and Europeans would have to do much more for their own security. Now, it's no longer important to play this ideological game of Europeanism versus Atlanticism. And actually, forging a strong European pillar within NATO can be very much complementary with the idea of European strategic autonomy, and also increase the legitimacy of the French discourse among Eastern European countries, because they can feel that at the end of the day, the objective is to strengthen the security of the European continent, not just to build a fantasy ideological object. So, this convergence between Europe and France was also the outcome of a French pivot to Europe. So there is a US pivot to Asia, perhaps, but also a French pivot to Europe. And quickly on this, because I said initially that the far right was becoming more powerful in the French debate, as in many European countries. So you may wonder, how does it fit this idea that French is more European now? And this is just an example that a tweet, basically, by the president of the National Rally, so the main far-right party in France, after Donald Trump's election. And basically, this tweet doesn't look like a traditional French nationalist statement. It very much looks like a traditional French pro-European statement. So you have expressions such as, we should rethink our relationship with power and strategic autonomy, so endorse basically strategic autonomy as an objective. European preference in defense, so a European policy in the area of defense. Fight against unfair international competition, so that's geoeconomics, that was what I mentioned earlier. Also this idea that in the face of rising great power competition, Europe should be stronger. So economic and influence war against Europe, we must take our destiny into our own hands. Here, an hypothesis is that it's also a strategy. And basically many populist parties in Europe feel that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is also successful because she managed to combine a populist, conservative agenda domestically, but also an international agenda that is compatible with the objective of the European Union and NATO. And basically, some people in the French debate, so that's also perhaps some kind of Italian influence in France, but it means that it's not necessarily in contradiction with the trends I was presenting earlier. And that would be my conclusion, because we started with the idea that the France, as a member state, as a government, was weakened in the debate. And my hypothesis that I would like to put forward here is that it's also in a moment when French ideas are no longer just put forward by French people. So there might not be a full contradiction between these two trends. The French state or the French government can be weaker, but those traditionally French ideas can continue to fly on their own, because now they are also promoted by people who are not French. And I just took two examples, Kaja Kallas, the new High Representative of the European Union, and Mario Draghi, obviously former Prime Minister here, but also because he wrote this important report that has been endorsed by the European Commission as the basis of its future agenda. In both cases, these two people were very much supported politically by the French. And actually, it was even in competition with one another, because initially the French would have liked to put Mario Draghi at the head of the European Commission. And since there are many factors involved, obviously, but since the French were not able to impose a head of the European Commission, they were able to push forward a like-minded high representative, because she is also from the same political family as President Macron. And in those two characters, you find again elements close to those French traditional ideas. With Kaja Kallas, the idea that the European Union should be a strong actor in the area of defense. She even supports defense bonds to finance European Union efforts in the area of defense. So that could be the new face of the French agenda at the European level. And Mario Draghi, obviously, with this idea that if Europeans let things go, they're going to a full economic decline. So we should not just let things go. There should be strong public investment in the European Union to make the European Union competitive. And he advocated this idea of 800 billion additional investment, public and private, but also public, and also hinted on the idea of potentially using common debts. So basically, that might be the way to solve the puzzle that we encountered initially, French ideas and weakening influence. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Okay, so thank you very much, Pierre. Now we have a few minutes for your questions and comments. So let's open the floor. Yes, there is one. Yes, we don't have the Wi-Fi mic, so you have to speak a little bit louder.
Stand up.
Oh yes, please stand up. Yes.
Well, thank you for your speech and your lesson.
Leonardo
My
from
name is
Chile.
Leonardo from Chile, yes. University of Chile. Well, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned there was competition between the orthodox vision of the European Union in terms of economy, this interventionism and protectionism of France in terms of economic as well. But I was wondering all the time, because yesterday we had an interesting discussion, how the intervention of, how the relationship between the President of France as a nation, and the Commission had this fight or this contest, how they will manage the topic of the Mercosur and European agreement. But you have one argument in there regarding that there is the position of France is not leaving the competition of the South American products gain the European market. But at some point you have the other vision that happened in 2019 when the French supported the Alstom and Siemens fusion. So in this field, that was like an anti-competitive method to intervene, and that's not really clear if it really France just supported like the big companies, France like in terms of competition, and not helping like the rest of the European citizens, or it's just sitting and giving the floor to the big companies like Alstom in this case, and the agrarian and the agricultural companies from France to succeed in their lobby against the French government. So how do you put the position in this imbalance? How would be the French position so anti-competitive in the previous Alstom and fusion, Alstom Siemens fusion, and now with the Mercosur agreement? That's like.
I will go one by one.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I don't really necessarily see a contradiction. Obviously, French government's trying to defend French economic interests. In the case of Alstom and Siemens, there was behind this idea of defending French interests the idea that European champions would be important to strengthen the European industry in general, and that a European weakness would be the absence of big European companies able to compete effectively with US or Chinese companies. So that was also the European narrative behind this. It was not completely against competition, it was the idea that you have to take into account the global competition and not just the competition within Europe. And anyway, just to finish on this point, the decision that was eventually adopted to integrate foreign subsidies in the competition policy is also, so it didn't affect the Alstom-Siemens fusion, but that was also a response to that. The idea that you should not just consider competition at the level of the European Union, but also at the global level. And if you have giant companies in the rest of the world, perhaps that also affects your assessment of competition. So basically, that was the idea. And yeah, you wanted to say something about this?
I understand completely your point. I also jot it down here, like the competition at the European internal level and the competition again with the main actors outside the European Union. I can understand that. But at some point, the Commission did or prohibited this fusion between these two companies because they wanted to promote and to safeguard the internal competition of the European market. So how can the vision of France in this case, in the global neo arena, be so relatable to the European Commission?
Now, in this case, it is certainly in contradiction with this position. And that's why also I said that within the European Commission, there were two sides. One really represented by Commissioner for Competition, Margaret Vestager, really promoting this kind of idea, and one represented by Commissioner Breton. And the two of them also clashed on many questions within the College of Commissioners. So obviously, I'm not saying that it represents the French position because it clashed with the French position. And about Mercosur, that would be different because it's not necessarily a question of competition. It's essentially connected to agricultural interest and also a question of environmental interest. So there is also a huge argument that is strong in France, I mean, that that international trade agreements should not be an opportunity to weaken environmental regulations or to open the doors to products or that we would not accept according to our own domestic standard, European standards. So that's the debate. And that's why the French insisted before the debate became a debate about yes or no about the Mercosur, they promoted this idea of mirror clauses. Basically, if you want to trade with us, you should have the same level of environmental protection that we do, which obviously is also a problem for the interlocutors because not everybody wants to have exactly the same standards as Europeans. But that's basically the state of the debate.
Other questions, comments, and so on? Yes, please.
Your title is EU finally becoming French. So my curiosity would be, should the EU in the present context become French?
Okay. So that's a normative question. That was not directly the objective of the presentation to develop a normative position. What I would say is that on many points, basically because it's not an outcome of French influence, actually. I don't know if it should, but in many ways that's also an evolution that comes from a global necessity. Okay? Of course, there's a question of how you do it and how willingly you embrace these new rules. But these are also new rules that do not necessarily originate from Europe. And this is also the way the French government would frame it. For instance, I remember there was a speech on Europe by President Macron in the spring titled Sorbonne II, so the second great speech on Europe in the Sorbonne University. And basically the argument he put forward in the speech was, are we going to be the last player to play by yesterday's rule when the United States, China are already playing with euros? That's how the French government would put it. So, in many ways, having a stronger European defense and having a European Union that is also able to defend its strategic interest through its economic policies, I think it is a necessity. Now you can have also degree, and that's also where you would have disagreement. For instance, even the Netherlands that I mentioned earlier as representing a reluctant player vis-a-vis this idea of strategizing everything and geoeconomics. The Netherlands also put forward its own assessment, its own definition of strategic economy. So even the Netherlands was in a way forced to play this game and to talk about strategic economy a few years ago. And now the debate becomes, what is strategic? Where do you put the definition exactly? Do you expand the definition of what is strategic, or do you have a narrow definition of what is strategic? And some of the arguments you would have between the French and other players within the European Union is some states saying, no, but for the French, everything now is strategic, and perhaps that's for very nationalist reasons, because they want to protect some weak industry, and so they discover that it is strategic all of a sudden, whereas it's not. So that's really the criticism. But the basic idea that we are living in a time marked by a geoeconomic turn, and that European defense should be stronger, I think it is difficult to deny.
Thank you. Further questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for speaking. My question is, would France happily accept the transforming Europe when its own influence has been declined, especially on the security defense? I mean, maybe the French government by Macron will be acceptance to it, but what if like Nepal? Because as far as I know that the politics in France is closer to the extreme right.
No, you're right, and that's why I started with this question. And I started with this problem of French weakening leadership in the European Union because of those electoral results. But I also showed that the position of the far right is also evolving in this context. So I'm not saying that at the end of the day they will converge, and if they come to power they will fully support the European defense agenda and the strong geo-economic Europe agenda and so on. I'm not saying that it will not be a problem. It can certainly be a problem. But it's also interesting to see that there are some elements in the French far right who also want to integrate these things. So we'll see. And I agree that there is also a potential for turbulence.
Yes. Professor Langwood.
Thank you. David Elwood, Johns Hopkins, Bologna. Sorry, I must go right after this, but there's so many interesting questions. Just one in particular. 2 weeks ago I heard Paolo Gentiloni, and he echoed very much what Draghi and Lett have been saying about the lack of European competitiveness. And he said, in America, the top 10 companies have all been born in the last 30 years. The 10 biggest companies have all been born in the last 30 years. In Europe, not one. Now, the fact that there's no repetition of Airbus, which you never mentioned, there's never been another Airbus. Is that a result of the working competition policy, anti-giantism, or is it simply because of entrepreneurial incapacity? What is the French attitude to these, the official attitude to these questions now? Competition, neoliberalism. How many people really believe in capitalism?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. I have to say I'm not an economist, so my expertise would have limits on this point. But if you ask me what are the elements of the French debate that would address this question, first, yes, that would be one aspect. Competition would be one aspect, but personally, I don't think that would be the most important one. The second aspect is actually closer to what has been put forward in the Draghi report, the question of investment. And that was very much at the center of Macron's speech. Basically, he talked a lot about investment. And so one question is the question of private investments. That's connected to the objective of a stronger capital markets union. Because you may know that there was a lot of money sleeping in bank deposits in Europe that is much less active and productive than private savings in the United States that are relatively much more invested in more risky investments in either like stock markets or hedge funds and so on. That is more useful to support innovation and risky innovation. So that would be an argument about innovation, investment and innovation. And basically when Macron said we are playing by yesterday's rule, he was also talking about investment. He was saying the Chinese Communist Party subsidized a lot its companies to be on the forefront of technological innovation. Now the United States with the so-called anti-inflation policy also in that subsidized a lot its companies, and Europeans, because they have those rules and also because they have a very limited budget at the European Union level, they cannot do these things. So the question is it possible to have a strong investment policy at the European level?
Great, thank you. Just one thing, that Bardella remark is very interesting. It reminds me of a comment by Ivan Kastek, who was an international commentator. When nationalists try to become internationalists, they will find it very difficult.
Okay, so other questions or comments? Okay, so you talked about the promotion by France of a second pillar, a European pillar, EU pillar within NATO.
Oh yeah.
So why doesn't France promote a EU pillar within the Security Council of the United Nations?
An EU pillar?
Yes. This is maybe provocative.
Now I see. This idea is sometimes mentioned in the French debate and attributed to German people who want to steal France's position within the Security Council. Now, to be more serious, France, the question of the European, the UN Security Council is blocked, but not really because of Europeans. Actually, the French and the British within the European Security Council would encourage enlargement. And actually, it might be surprising, but those who are against veto any form of enlargement, they are not those all European nations that are seen as benefiting from an old vision of the balance of power. But there are also the new powers. For instance, China is against many changes in the UN Security Council because some of the clearest candidates for enlargement of the Security Council will be those neighbors, such as Japan, India, and that's also a problem. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a big debate because the debate on the UN Security Council is blocked from us as well.
But you know, France is the only European permanent member, EU permanent member in the Security Council. So why doesn't France think of Europeanized to some extent its permanent permanent seat? You know. Yes. It would mean sharing. Yes. It would increase its soft power in Europe. It would, make it a leader in Europe also, you know. Yes.
It depends on how it would be done completely. The difficulty is that when you have an advantage, if you have to renounce this advantage, you want something in return. Okay? So that means that if really, and there are some, I would say, informal ways to do that, like having some kind of EU contribution in the UN Security Council, because not just permanent members, and very often European members, so sharing information and having close consultations among European members within the UN. But it will be obviously sensitive for the French government to tell the French population, we have something and we abandon this. Because many people would say, and in particular I suspect among the nationalists, right, so we are abandoning French power, we are abandoning the basis of French statutes. So I'm not saying that it would be completely out of the question. I think it could be a realistic prospect if there is first a pressing need for that, and second, some perspective for a transaction that would somehow be also of interest for the French, if you want to deal with it.
Other questions or comments? Okay, so otherwise, perfectly in line. So that's it. Thank you very much, Professor Haroche.